Oh, you thought Diddy was bad? Well, he is. But you want to meet someone who's arguably worse? Vince McMahon. See, Vince McMahon had a problem. He's currently under federal investigation for misconduct with many.
When we think of powerful people being exposed, we usually imagine billionaires or moguls, but one name stands above them all: Vincent Kennedy McMahon. After decades of building an empire surrounded by allegations and cover-ups, he now seems to be panicking as his final days as a free man might be approaching. This is the story of an empire built on secrets. Before diving into the world of federal investigations, accusations of trafficking, and years of misconduct, let's first understand how untouchable this man believed he was. Vince McMahon didn't just play the role of a villain on television, he became one. He created a character so corrupt and morally broken that fans often struggle to tell where Vince McMahon the performer ended and Vince McMahon the person began. That's not an exaggeration, but a genuine psychological maze wrestling fans have been trapped in for years, watching storylines that felt disturbingly real and uncomfortably close to the truth. One storyline, in particular, reveals the kind of man we're dealing with. In the mid-2000s, McMahon wrote a plot involving his real-life daughter, Stephanie McMahon, who also worked for WWE and appeared as herself on television. This wasn't some made-up family drama, this was his actual daughter, who at the time was married to wrestler Triple H and expecting a child. When Stephanie and her husband refused to take part in this highly inappropriate storyline, McMahon reportedly didn't just accept their decision. According to several sources, McMahon then suggested changing the storyline so that his son, Shane McMahon, would be portrayed as the father instead, meaning his own son would be shown as the father of his daughter's child on television, all for the sake of entertainment. Think about that for a moment. This was a man so comfortable with disturbing, incestuous ideas involving his real family members that he actually pitched multiple versions of the same storyline. And when everyone involved refused to go along with it, he still found ways to sneak elements of it onto television through promotional segments and backstage scenes that hinted at those same themes. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a clear look into the mind of someone who saw moral boundaries, decency, and the well-being of others as obstacles to be bent, manipulated, or ignored for his creative vision. What makes this even more unsettling is that McMahon wasn't hiding any of it. He was showing this behavior openly to millions of viewers every single week. He was so sure of his power, so convinced that he was untouchable that he didn't even bother to conceal his worst impulses. Instead, he disguised them as entertainment, as storylines, as just another part of the show. And for decades, it worked. The wrestling industry, the media, sponsors, and corporate partners all looked the other way because the money kept coming in, the ratings stayed high, and Vince McMahon's empire continued to grow. This pattern of alleged misconduct and abuse of power didn't begin in the 2000s. According to detailed investigative reports and multiple lawsuits, McMahon's alleged behavior stretches back decades, with accusations spanning from the 1980s all the way to 2022. That's a 40-year history filled with claims of sexual harassment, assault, trafficking, and systematic cover-ups using non-disclosure agreements and multi-million-dollar settlements. The FBI's interest in McMahon isn't new either. This is actually the second major federal investigation involving WWE during his rule. The first occurred in 1994, when the FBI and DEA launched Operation Piledriver, a large-scale probe into steroid distribution across the professional wrestling world. McMahon was indicted on several felony charges, accused of running what prosecutors described as a juice machine, pressuring wrestlers to use steroids to maintain the physiques demanded for television. The trial lasted 3 weeks, included testimony from wrestling icons like Hulk Hogan, and ended with McMahon being acquitted of all charges. But what's most important to understand is that even though he walked free, the trial exposed a deep-rooted culture inside WWE that was willing to blur legal, moral, and human boundaries in pursuit of entertainment and profit. Wrestlers spoke about the pressure to use performance-enhancing drugs, the damage it did to their bodies, and the fear of losing their jobs if they refused. And when McMahon survived that level of federal scrutiny and still beat the charges, it only strengthened his belief that he was truly untouchable. For nearly 30 years after that acquittal, it seemed he was right. But then came 2022, and everything began to fall apart in a way that even Vince McMahon couldn't control or rewrite. In June of that year, the Wall Street Journal published a story that changed everything. It revealed that McMahon had secretly paid $3 million to a former employee with whom he allegedly had an affair. This wasn't just a scandal about a powerful man's personal life, it was a serious violation of WWE's disclosure requirements, showing that McMahon had allegedly used company money to hide relationships that could create legal risks for both him and the company. Within 2 days of the report's release, McMahon stepped down as WWE's chairman and CEO. But here's where it gets revealing. Even after resigning, he never gave up his control. McMahon still owned the majority of WWE's shares, which meant he continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes. And, in a move that surprised no one who understood corporate power, He forced his way back onto WWE's board of directors in January 2023, just 7 months after his supposed downfall. But that $3 million payment turned out to be only the beginning. As reporters continued investigating, they uncovered a series of hush money payments totaling more than $12 million paid to multiple women over many years. This wasn't a single mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment, or an isolated relationship gone wrong. It was a long-running system of silencing allegations of sexual misconduct stretching across decades. Each of these payments was allegedly made to shield McMahon and WWE from exposure, from lawsuits, and from the consequences that ordinary people would face for abusing their power. The Securities and Exchange Commission soon took notice, revealing just how completely the system meant to ensure corporate transparency had failed to hold Vince McMahon accountable in any meaningful way. Despite the growing list of revelations, resignations, and investigations, McMahon continued to deny all allegations, dismissing them as lies and distortions. Even with the controversy surrounding him, he maintained significant control and influence over WWE and its parent company, TKO Group Holdings, which was formed in 2023 through the merger of WWE and UFC. In fact, TKO became so concerned about the potential damage McMahon's involvement could cause that they explicitly warned investors in SEC filings that his presence on the board could lead to negative publicity and serious financial or operational consequences. That was when the FBI decided to take another look at Vince McMahon and WWE, but this time their focus wasn't on steroid distribution or drug policies, it was on something far more severe. Federal investigators began examining allegations of sexual assault, trafficking, and a widespread cover-up that allegedly reached the highest levels of one of America's most recognizable entertainment empires. The lawsuit that changed everything came on January 25th, 2024, when a former WWE employee named Janelle Grant filed a federal case that finally pulled back the curtain on what had allegedly been happening behind the scenes at WWE for years. This wasn't another quiet settlement or private negotiation hidden from the public eye. Grant, represented by well-known attorney Ann Callis, made the courageous choice to reveal her identity despite the explicit and deeply disturbing nature of the allegations she was bringing forward. The 67-page complaint, filed in U.S. District Court in Connecticut, read less like a typical civil lawsuit and more like a criminal indictment, outlining years of alleged sexual abuse, trafficking, and psychological manipulation that Grant says destroyed her life. According to the lawsuit, Grant met Vince McMahon in 2019 when they lived in the same building in Connecticut. At the time, she was in an extremely vulnerable state. She had been the full-time caregiver for both of her parents, who had recently passed away, and she had lost the family home in their bankruptcy. She was grieving, emotionally shattered, and struggling financially. McMahon, according to the complaint, befriended her during this fragile period, offering her comfort, attention, and support. Eventually, he promised her a position at WWE that, as she believed, would help her rebuild her life and regain stability. But there was a catch, in fact. There were many, and all of them involved sexual coercion and abuse. Grant claims that from the very beginning, McMahon made it clear that any professional opportunity at WWE would depend on maintaining a sexual relationship with him. The lawsuit describes a disturbing pattern that allegedly began with McMahon greeting her in his underwear at his condominium, pulling her close, sharing personal and intimate details about his life, and gradually escalating to explicit sexual demands that Grant felt powerless to refuse if she wanted the job she desperately needed. Eventually, she was given a position at WWE with the title of Administrative Coordinator in the Legal Department, a role that, according to the lawsuit, was essentially fabricated so McMahon could keep her within reach whenever he wanted. Later, she was transferred to the Talent Relations Department, which was headed by John Laurinaitis, a former wrestler and WWE executive, who was also named as a co-defendant in the lawsuit. This is where the allegations become even more disturbing and systematic. Grant alleges that McMahon didn't just abuse her himself. He allegedly shared explicit photos and videos of her with other men both inside and outside WWE. According to the complaint, these materials were circulated without her consent, turning what began as workplace exploitation into something far more sinister. This wasn't just harassment or assault, it was, as the lawsuit describes, trafficking in its purest and most horrifying form. The lawsuit includes detailed and deeply disturbing accounts of what Janelle Grant says she endured while working under Vince McMahon's control. According to the filing, McMahon allegedly arranged situations that went far beyond professional boundaries and forced Grant into degrading and abusive encounters, sometimes involving other individuals connected to WWE. The complaint claims she was pressured to engage in sexual activity at various times, including during work hours and on company property, often under threats or manipulation that made refusal feel impossible. And it also accuses both McMahon and former executive John Laurinaitis of participating in and enabling this ongoing pattern of abuse. The psychological and physical toll on Grant, as described in the lawsuit, was devastating She reportedly suffered panic attacks, insomnia, exhaustion, and other severe stress-related health problems. And when she sought medical help, McMahon allegedly intervened and directed her to a doctor of his choosing, someone the complaint suggests was selected to protect his interests rather than acknowledge the trauma she was enduring. One of the most disturbing allegations in the complaint involves a WWE superstar whose identity is not revealed in the court documents. Grant claims that McMahon allegedly used her as leverage to convince this wrestler to sign a new contract with WWE, a situation she describes as being treated like an object for his personal gain. According to the lawsuit, McMahon reportedly referred to her in dehumanizing terms, language that, if true, echoes some of the darkest abuses of power in history, applied by one of the most influential men in entertainment. During this time, McMahon allegedly gave Grant gifts, but the lawsuit frames these not as acts of a consensual relationship, but as part of ongoing coercion and control. Then, in January 2022, everything changed. McMahon told Grant that his wife, Linda McMahon, had discovered their alleged relationship, informed her that her time at WWE was over, and pressured her to sign a non-disclosure agreement to keep all that had allegedly occurred a secret. According to the lawsuit, McMahon allegedly pressured Grant to sign the NDA, warning her that refusal would not only put him, his family, and WWE at risk, but that she would become a public headline, suffer reputational damage, face exposure of explicit materials, and be crushed under the weight of McMahon's vast resources. In other words, a woman who alleges years of sexual abuse and trafficking by one of the most powerful men in entertainment was told that if she didn't surrender her right to speak, she would be destroyed financially, professionally, and personally, and portrayed as a willing participant rather than a victim of systematic abuse. The lawsuit claims that Grant signed the NDA in exchange for payments that McMahon later stopped making, a decision that ultimately led to her filing this lawsuit. When reporting in 2022 revealed hush money payments to other women, McMahon's payments to Grant allegedly slowed as he faced mounting obligations to multiple women. The complaint further alleges that high-ranking WWE executives were aware of the sexual relationship, contributing to Grant's emotional distress, and she is now seeking to have the NDA invalidated, arguing that it was signed under duress and is unreasonably broad under Connecticut law. She is also seeking both compensatory and punitive damages, with the punitive damages specifically intended to punish the defendants and deter similar conduct in the future. The lawsuit is more than one woman's fight for justice. It could mark a turning point for accountability in an industry that, for decades, has often prioritized entertainment over the safety and well-being of its employees. These allegations also brought the FBI's full attention, triggering a federal investigation and setting the stage for a broader reckoning. Just days after Janelle Grant's lawsuit became public, the Wall Street Journal reported that federal authorities in New York were investigating Vince McMahon for sexual assault and trafficking. This investigation was not a direct response to Grant's lawsuit. The FBI had already been quietly building its case for months. In fact, the probe began in August 2023 when federal agents executed a search warrant and issued subpoenas at McMahon's Connecticut residence. According to reports, federal agents were specifically searching for evidence related to the hush money payments, including financial records, text messages, emails, or anything that could show McMahon had systematically covered up sexual misconduct and potentially used corporate funds to do so. Sources familiar with the investigation said investigators were particularly focused on text-based communications that might indicate McMahon attempted to evade company audits and internal controls. The FBI needed physical evidence from his residence to complete their case. The investigation examined several potential federal crimes. First, whether McMahon had falsified corporate records to conceal the hush money payments, which could constitute fraud. Second, whether the payments themselves were structured in a way that violated federal financial reporting requirements. And third, and most serious, whether McMahon's alleged conduct violated the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, the same law referenced in Grant's civil lawsuit. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act carries severe legal penalties and is a cornerstone statute for prosecuting cases of trafficking and exploitation in the United States. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act is the same. Law used to prosecute international human trafficking rings, domestic sex trafficking, and cases involving the exploitation of vulnerable individuals for commercial sex acts. For the FBI, applying this statute to McMahon meant they believed there was evidence suggesting he didn't just harass or assault women, but allegedly recruited and coerced them into sexual activities using fraud, threats, and his position of power. If convicted under the TVPA, McMahon could face decades in prison. However, federal investigations and prosecutions are notoriously challenging. In February 2025, reports emerged that the Department of Justice decided not to pursue criminal charges related to the alleged cover-up, as prosecutors reportedly determined there wasn't enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to prove he intentionally falsified records or structured payments in violation of federal law. Even a small doubt in one juror's mind can prevent a conviction. Crucially, though, the investigation into the trafficking allegations remains active. The DOJ's decision not to prosecute the cover-up does not impact Grant's civil lawsuit, does not block potential future criminal charges, and does not mean McMahon is in the clear. In fact, one of the co-defendants in Grant's lawsuit, John Laurinaitis, is reportedly cooperating with federal investigators, which could have significant implications for the ongoing probe. When a co-defendant files and agrees to cooperate, it's often a sign that prosecutors are building a larger case against the primary target in this instance, Vince McMahon. Think about what Laurinaitis' cooperation could mean. According to Grant, he was present during some of the alleged assaults, allegedly witnessed McMahon's actions, received instructions from him, and saw firsthand how the system of cover-ups and hush money payments operated. If he is cooperating, he is likely providing investigators with testimony, documents, text messages, emails, and other evidence that could corroborate Grant's allegations and potentially implicate other WWE employees who may have known about McMahon's alleged conduct. The immediate corporate fallout has been significant. When Grant's lawsuit became public in January 2024, Slim Jim, one of WWE's major sponsors, immediately withdrew from the Royal Rumble event scheduled for the next day. Around the same time, TKO Group Holdings executives, including Mark Hero and Ari Emanuel, who became McMahon's superiors through the WWE-UFC merger, urged him to resign from the board. McMahon complied, issuing a statement claiming he was stepping down out of respect for the WWE universe, while simultaneously denying all wrongdoing and labeling Grant's claims as lies and vindictive distortions. Despite stepping down, McMahon still benefits financially from WWE's success and retains influence, connections, and resources that could allow him to fight these allegations in court for years if necessary. McMahon's legal team has made it clear that they intend to aggressively defend him, arguing that Grant's allegations are false, that any sexual relationship was consensual, and that the NDA she signed is a valid contract preventing her from making these claims public. In his public statements, McMahon has consistently maintained his innocence, asserting that Grant's claims are lies, fabricated incidents, and distortions of the truth, and pledging to vigorously defend himself against what he calls baseless accusations. The defense strategy appears straightforward. Deny wrongdoing, challenge Grant's credibility, argue that text messages or other evidence are taken out of context, and maintain that any relationship that occurred was fully consensual. Lawyers may point to instances of seemingly friendly or flirtatious communication to support this position, though experts note that victims of abuse and trafficking often feel compelled to comply to survive or avoid consequences, making such consent highly misleading. These are the kinds of he said, she said situations that make sexual assault and harassment cases so difficult to prosecute or win in civil court. But what makes Grant's case different from many others is that she is not alone in coming forward. Grant's lawsuit emphasizes that she is coming forward not just for herself, but on behalf of those who are too afraid to speak out, a statement that is both bold and powerful. It raises questions about the full scope of alleged misconduct. 4 women are publicly known, but how many more might there be? How many settlements were structured differently, hidden more carefully, and never uncovered by journalists or investigators? How many women accepted payouts, signed NDAs, and moved on while still carrying the trauma of what allegedly happened to them? The pattern itself is what makes this case so damning. One allegation of sexual misconduct could be dismissed as a misunderstanding or an isolated incident, but 3, 4, 5 allegations begin to form a clear pattern of behavior. When that pattern is considered alongside the alleged text messages, references to women as objects, and claims that explicit materials were shared with business contacts, it paints a picture that goes far beyond a consensual relationship between a powerful man and an employee. What we are witnessing is a potential reckoning for alleged abuse fueled by power, wealth, and a corporate culture that prioritized success and profitability over the safety and well-being of its employees. WWE built a multi-billion-dollar empire, entertaining millions of fans worldwide, creating childhood heroes and unforgettable moments. Yet according to these allegations, that success may have come at a profound human cost behind the scenes. But if Grant's allegations are true, that empire was built on the suffering of women who were allegedly exploited, abused, trafficked, and then paid to stay silent about what happened to them. The wrestling industry has been forced to confront these realities. Fans who watched Vince McMahon play a villain on television now have to consider that some of the cruelty, manipulation, and abuse of power they saw may not have been entirely scripted that behind the storylines. Real harm could have been occurring. Alleged hush money payments were reportedly used not just to protect trade secrets or business strategies, but to silence victims. This situation highlights just how difficult it is for ordinary people to seek justice against the wealthy and powerful, even when they have evidence, witnesses, and are telling the truth. The FBI investigation continues, Grant's civil lawsuit continues, and new information about McMahon's alleged conduct and WWE's alleged knowledge and complicity keeps emerging. shedding light on the possible scope of what happened behind the scenes of one of America's most beloved forms of entertainment. Vince McMahon remains a free man, maintains his innocence, and has the resources to fight these allegations as long as necessary. Janelle Grant continues to pursue her case, faces scrutiny and cross-examination, and lives with the trauma she alleges occurred. The FBI continues building its investigation, which may or may not lead to criminal charges, while WWE continues to entertain millions of fans worldwide, attempting to distance itself from its founder's alleged actions while still benefiting from the empire he created. What we can say with certainty is that the story of Vince McMahon, Janelle Grant, and WWE is far from over. The era of Vince McMahon operating in the shadows, using NDAs and settlements to make problems disappear and avoiding consequences for decades of alleged misconduct, now appears to be over. Whether it ends in criminal convictions, civil judgments, complete vindication, or something in between remains to be seen, but the investigation, the lawsuit, and the public attention represent a level of accountability McMahon largely avoided for most of his career. And, while the principle of innocent until proven guilty absolutely applies, McMahon deserves a fair legal process, the chance to defend himself, and the presumption of innocence in court that doesn't mean the allegations should be ignored, the accusers dismissed, or patterns of behavior overlooked. The legal system will determine his guilt or innocence on specific charges, but the public can examine the totality of evidence that has emerged and consider the kind of person he may be and the kind of empire he built. This story is far from over, but one thing is clear. Vince McMahon, the man who spent decades defining himself through his on-screen character, may finally be facing the reality of how he is perceived. That brings us to the end of this story.